Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We will wait a minute or so more as some folks continue to file in, but we're really excited to have you all here with us. And while we are waiting, we're hoping folks can introduce themselves briefly in the chat. Just let us know where you're calling in from. If you have any organizational affiliation, just so we can get a better sense of who all is in the room with us today. And you'll want to make sure that you're sending it to the panelists and all attendees so that we can all see who's here. Awesome, it's great to see where everyone's coming from. If you're just joining us, we are introducing ourselves in the chat, letting us know where you're calling in from, if you have any organizational affiliation, and we'll get started shortly. Thank you all for joining us today. Awesome, great to see a lot of Audubon folks here. Okay, great. I think I will go ahead and get started since we have a lot to cover today. So my name is Mika. I am with the Audubon Center at Debs Park. We're located in Los Angeles. And before we get started, I just want to go through a few housekeeping items. So if we could go to the next slide there. Awesome, thank you. So as we're running through this webinar, questions can be submitted to the chat. Anything that comes up, please make sure that you're entering it in there. We will be compiling these and we hope to answer as many as we can during the Q&A portion towards the end. I also want to highlight that you all are more than welcome to the guide as we're going through all of this. So many of you may have already seen it, but for those that have not, it can be found at greeninginplace.org. So we'll drop that link into the chat as well, and the guide can be viewed and downloaded from there. And then I also want to highlight that we will be recording this webinar. We'll be sending out the follow-up email afterwards, so please feel free to share that with anyone who maybe wasn't able to join us this morning or this afternoon if you're on the East Coast. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So I think as many of you know, this guide was created by the Audubon Center at Debs Park in partnership with a few other organizations here in Los Angeles. So we were super lucky to be able to work with the Southeast Asian Community Alliance, or SICA LA, with Public Counsel and with Team Friday as well. And I just want to highlight that the creation of this guide would not have been possible without this diverse group of partners. So we are extremely grateful for their partnership. It also would not have been possible without funding through California Proposition 1 through the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy. So we definitely want to extend a huge thank you to the funder as well. We have been working on this guide for quite a while now, so we are extremely excited to finally be launching it and to be sharing it with you all. And we hope it'll be a really valuable tool and resource moving forward. We'll be going into the guide in a lot more depth throughout this webinar, but just to provide a brief overview, the guide is called Greening in Place, Protecting Communities from Displacement, and it provides a framework for equitable green development, and it outlines a number of strategies that can be used to really invest in local communities and to combat the displacement and gentrification that has unfortunately often been a consequence of urban green infrastructure development. So turning to the agenda here, I will be turning it over to our moderator shortly for our panel portion of the webinar. after which we will have some time for Q&A. So just a reminder again to make sure that you are entering any questions that you may have into the chat. I will be turning off the chat to all attendees once we start the panel, but you'll still be able to submit your questions directly to the panelists, and we will be gathering those and we'll address those at the end. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so next I would like to introduce our moderator for today. We are thrilled to be joined today by Sarah Rascon, who is the Urban River Program Officer at the Mountains Recreation and Conservation Authority, or MRCA, located here in Los Angeles. MRCA is a local public park agency that manages more than 73,000 acres of public land. And for over 20 years, it has been one of the lead agencies revitalizing the Los Angeles River and its tributaries. So Sarah is no stranger to the topics that we will be discussing today. Through her role as Urban River Program Officer, has led the agency's engagement with local communities, with elected officials, local organizations, and public agencies to work together to revitalize the LA River. And this revitalization of the river is one of the largest green infrastructure development projects taking place in LA City and County right now. Sarah is a native Angelino, and she has a deep personal connection to this work. So we are super happy that she was able to join us today to help facilitate this conversation. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarah, who's going to briefly introduce today's panelists, and then we'll get into the panel itself. So thank you all again for coming. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Mika, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. This is a really timely guide and document that we as an agency at MRCA and the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy are really looking forward to, and can really help guide our green infrastructure, urban greening efforts, and really put community first and help preserve the existing community, and hope to get some good suggestions and recommendations that not only preserve existing communities, but can really set the stage for future green development and not have adverse effects on the communities that we are trying to improve. So with that said, I'd like to introduce Marcos Trinidad, the Executive Director of the Audubon Center at Debs Park. Hi, Marcos. Thanks for being with us. Thank you to all the panelists for being with us. Marcos, can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of the Greening in Place guide, and why did Audubon choose to get involved in developing this guide? It's not something often that Audubon Center would get involved in, but what made this discussion so significant that you all wanted to get engaged in regards to community anti-displacement efforts?
Thank you, Sarah, and hello, everyone. I just want to start off with, I'm honored to be on this panel with everyone, and I'm really excited that this is available to everyone now. And Sarah, please, at any moment, if a fly lands on my head, please tell me. You can stop me. If the audience out there, text me, Slack me, whatever. Just make sure that I'm able to brush it away. Thank you for the question. I think a lot of folks were really surprised that Audubon would take something like this on because of our work historically, focusing on conservation and doing great and wonderful things for birds all over the country, all over our flyways. And I feel as Audubon shifts from doing, I don't want to, let me correct that, not just shift, but as we include and continue to include work in the urban area, we're starting to see that the approach and the methods and the need for looking at conservation in an urban area needs to be different. And our work at Debs Park was, I think, done in a way where we're able to take a holistic approach to the work that we do, meaning that we're not just looking at conservation and the ecosystem for birds and wildlife. We're looking at conservation and an ecosystem with humans in that system. And our work along the river reflects that. And really what we were coming up to with our community members over and over again was that a lot of work was happening on the river, specifically Los Angeles River, but this is all over the place. And it was done in a way that was adding trees to the neighborhood. We were adding parks. When I say we as a community, bicycle lanes, all these great things. And community members started to notice a lot of their community changing just in demographics. So what we were starting to see a lot more of is as we were going out in the community and advertising our events and doing outreach, we started noticing that community members were concerned. And a lot of the questions that we were being asked is, why are we going to build this in our neighborhood if it's only going to be for someone else? And we are not going to be living here when this park opens because of property value increasing, and now a neighborhood that was desirable to live for few are now, the neighborhood is now being looked at as desirable to be lived in by many because of all of these different projects coming in. So for us, having these discussions with our partners and specifically with Sissy and Sika, it was just like Audubon needs to do something. Audubon, if we're going to be in a neighborhood working with community, we don't get to choose which part of the community we work with. We need to work with the community. I often say, you know, we have to love the crust of the bread as well. So it's not that we need to now become experts every part of social issues that are happening because there's experts already out there. We just need to be aware of their work, and we need to partner with them whenever we can. So a lot of that has been, I think, key to a lot of our success along the LA River with our projects and with our partnerships, and just being able to navigate through the bureaucracy and everything that goes on when you have such high profile projects and housing issues and homelessness and everything that is happening. So one thing we're starting to see is that as a big green organization, we need to be able to adapt with the practices and the methods that we're using. So this was really an opportunity for us to take a leading role in bringing issues that were brought up by the community to the rest of our partners on the conservation side, on the city side. And it was a great way for us to partner with organizations that were already doing this work and that have been doing this work for a really long time, but just had a very different audience. And we're able to bring that conservation piece to it.
Great. Thank you, Marcos. So we will hold questions until the end, and now we'll be moving on to our next panelist. I'd like to introduce Sissy Trinh. Sissy is the founder and executive director of the Southeast Asian Community Alliance, SICA LA. Hi, Sissy.
Morning or afternoon, I guess, depending on where you're coming from. Can we stop the screen share for a bit?
Sissy, I have a couple of questions for you when you're ready.
Okay, go ahead.
Who is the Greening in Place Protecting Communities from Displacement Guide for? How do you envision the guide being used? And how does this guide fit into our current moment, given everything happening at this time?
Those are a lot of questions. I will do my best in my allotted time. So basically, the guide is really for green park agencies and organizations, both government like, the Mountains Recreation Conservation Authority where you work, Sarah, but also like nonprofits like Audubon. I think, we've been working on green gentrification for about 10 years. And what we realized when we were talking to groups like MRCA or Audubon was a desire to do something, but also feeling really overwhelmed at where to start, right? Our housing crisis, in particular in LA, feels like you're facing Mount Everest, right? It just is so daunting, so overwhelming. And I think there was a lot of fear of, are we gonna engage in mission creep? Can we do anything given we're a park, conservation organization? Isn't this kind of like completely out of our scope? What if we do something that's wrong, right? And makes things worse? And I totally get those concerns. And I think that was what the purpose of the guide was for, was to give green agencies and organizations a starting place, right? I was having a conversation earlier with Guadalupe and how we were talking about a lot of times organizations look at this issue and they see it as like, where do we even start? And my answer to her was by taking one step, right? And in the case of Audubon and Sika, like that first step was me and Marcos meeting up for coffee, right? And him sharing his concerns, what he was experiencing and seeing at the park and in the surrounding neighborhoods. And then me kind of saying like, well, this is what we're working on, and brainstorming ways in which we could leverage Audubon's strengths and assets to support Sika's housing justice work, right? Because we don't want to, like, again, have organizations like yours engage in mission drift, which you can't do as a government agency either, right? And so we created this guide, and it's really thorough. Please don't feel overwhelmed. There's a lot of strategies, but there's also a lot of case studies of programs and projects that have done it right. And then there's also an implementation guide. So can we pull up the slide number 7? So the implementation guide is really designed, it's not like every organization does the exact same thing. It's really designed to give people a sense of like where to start, depending on what kind of project you're working on. Next slide. So if you are in pre-construction, like pre-development phase, there's one set of strategies. If you have a park that's been in operation for many years, there's going to be a different set of strategies. But I think just starting from the very beginning, like when you first have that first interaction, and I'm talking to all the green agencies and organizations specifically, when you have that first interaction with a community member and they say something like, this project isn't for us, we're going to get gentrified. Why should we be focusing on supporting this if we're not going to have a home after this project is built, right? I think one of the biggest words of advice I would say is not to say dismiss it. And a lot of times, these park agencies and organizations are coming from a place of, this isn't what we do and this isn't what we know, and we have no expertise in this. But community members hear, you don't care, right? Which obviously is not the case. And oftentimes what I find helpful is to say, we're trying to figure that out too. We're working in partnership with different organizations. And, in the guide, we talk about a number of different strategies that projects can implement immediately, from something as simple as, when you buy your snacks and supplies, buy it from a local bakery or a local business, right? You can also, tell them and make an effort to say like, hey, we're gonna hire a number of positions for, to be filled by local residents. Can you help us find some people to work on this project? And, they'll get paid well and they'll get benefits, those kinds of things. So there's lots of different ways. Can we get the next slide? But again, ultimately, your goal is park agencies want to make communities healthier, stronger, better, more resilient to climate change, all of those things. But unfortunately, given the scope of our housing crisis, you can't ignore the issue. just like the housing sector can't ignore the climate crisis, right? And I think that for us, that was the whole point of this project, was to really give us time to collaborate and to learn from each other. Because when we, started, we didn't know what we could do together, right? And a lot of it, the first year was, hey, how do you do your work? And then Audubon asking me and asking public counsel, hey, how do you guys do your work? And then the second year was figuring out where are the opportunities for collaboration. And I will say we were very, very lucky that MRCA was willing to fund us to develop this guide, and in many ways fund us to learn how to work in partnership with each other.
Great, thank you, Sissy. Anything else you want to add? Oh, how does this guide fit into our current moment, given everything happening, being in a pandemic? You touched a little bit about our housing issues here in LA that I'm sure other states are facing as well, and housing our unhoused neighbors, but specifically, being in a pandemic and racial equity.
Mm-hmm. We can stop the screen sharing. So I think with the pandemic, what we've seen, at least here in LA, is that parks are being used as more than just recreation spaces, right? So in California, they're being used as emergency shelters for homeless residents who are at high risk of COVID. They're using them as distribution centers for food assistance. A lot of the school meal, grab and go centers. They're also being used as cooling centers. We just had a heat wave recently. So these kinds of collaborations are going to be more and more commonplace, just because we don't have the luxury of having just housing or just parks, right? We have to have integrated infrastructure, and infrastructure that can serve multiple purposes in emergencies like a pandemic. So this collaboration is really about how to create the testing ground for how to do it long term, and so for us, a lot of it is about trust building, about identifying each sector's strengths and assets, and then identifying long-term infrastructure that is needed to support that collaboration.
Great, well said, Sissy, thank you. I'd now like to move on to our next panelist. Hi, Faizah. Faizah Malik is the Senior Staff Attorney at the Public Counsel. Faizah, can you walk us through this guide and the anti-displacement strategies that are suggested by the collaborative group that developed the guide?
Sure. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Faizah Malik, and I'm a Senior Staff Attorney with the Community Development Project at Public Counsel, which is based in Los Angeles. We are a nonprofit legal services organization that fights for civil rights and economic justice. And our approach within the Community Development Project involves legal and capacity building, support to nonprofits, support to small businesses, advocacy to remove barriers to childcare and affordable housing, and anti-displacement affordable housing advocacy, and with a focus on community-centered equitable development. And we really have a lot of expertise in housing and land use. And so that's where we came to this work in this guide. So in this guide, I'm just gonna go over some of the key definitions and then an overview, because the guide itself is very detailed on all of the different strategies, but I'm just gonna go over some of the definitions in those strategies. So in the guide, we present a framework for equitable green development and the strategies to reduce the potential displacement impacts that green infrastructure investments can have in communities. We define equitable green development as development that prioritizes investment in and engagement with low-income communities and communities of color that have been historically excluded and are harmed by land use and environmental policy decisions. An equitable green development framework aims to rectify past environmental harms and improve access to green infrastructure in low-income communities and communities of color. Equitable green development ensures that green development benefits these communities without displacement. When we talk about green infrastructure in the guide, we're referring to it broadly to developments promoted on the bases of environmental sustainability and urban greening, and includes a broad range of projects from park development to bicycle infrastructure. And in Los Angeles, we're going to talk about this a little bit later. It includes the large projects like the ongoing revitalization of the LA River. So green infrastructure can provide multiple benefits, as everyone knows, including positive health, environmental, climate, economic impacts to neighborhoods and local communities. But as has been pointed out, these investments, together with shifting job and housing markets, can also set in motion or intensify a process of gentrification and displacement, a process called green gentrification. So combating this process takes a range of policy tools. We can go to the next slide, I think, on the tools. Yeah, right there. There is no single blueprint, and multiple anti-displacement tools must be layered together and tailored to the project-specific risks of each green infrastructure investment, taking into account deep levels of community input. The precise mix of policies and programs should be context-specific and driven by activated organizations such as SECA and community leaders in affected low-income neighborhoods. In the guide, we include a menu of policies, programs, and standards. And so I'll highlight some of those right now. And the guide includes 6 categories of strategies: tenant protections, land use and housing, aligning funding with equitable outcomes, enhancing economic opportunities, community engagement and ownership, and design and operations. And tenant protections first are one of the most important ways to protect against displacement. And the guide talks about in depth about a bunch of different policies that can be pursued, including rent stabilization, just cause protections from eviction, tenant buyout regulation, code enforcement, tenant education and outreach, and ensuring right to counsel in eviction proceedings. And this will ensure that tenants are not evicted after a project comes to their neighborhood, essentially. And second, land use, zoning, and housing tools can help ensure that affordable housing and other community serving assets will be built and preserved to help combat displacement pressures. And in the guide, we highlight a number of different tools that can be used, including equitable green overlay zones, inclusionary zoning, value capture and affordable housing incentives, no net loss and affordable housing preservation, displacement impact reports, community benefits agreements, joint development of parks and open space and housing, surplus public land disposition. And the third category is about funding and aligning funding with equitable outcomes. So rather than advocating for equity after funding has been distributed, it's important to set parameters governing the distribution of funds that include equity and ensure that equity is a more systemic and effective way to guide green infrastructure expansion and development. So it's more responsive to community needs. Under enhancing economic opportunities, this is about preserving existing community serving small businesses, supporting small business development, and then policies to support local workers, such as local and targeted hire and the living wage. And under community engagement and ownership, we recommend building community capacity and ownership of a project, including stakeholder notification, language access, strengthening community knowledge and skills, partnering with community-based organizations, community or ownership policies such as community land trusts, tenant community opportunity to purchase, ensuring more community stewardship of projects, and ensuring more accountability and monitoring in projects. And lastly, the guide also talks about design and operations and how that can advance equitable green development, and touches on ensuring inclusive design and avoiding hostile architecture, ensuring programs and operations welcome everyone, and lastly, pursuing public safety strategies that avoid policing and over-policing. So that's a lot of information and a very broad overview of the strategies in the guide, and we recommend going to it and reading about each one and reaching out if you have any questions. And Public Counsel works with a lot of community groups to implement a lot of these strategies and stand behind all of them as effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Faizah. We learned a lot from you right now. Now we'll be moving on to Guadalupe. Guadalupe is with Supervisor Hilda Solis' office, and she is the planning deputy.
Hi, Guadalupe. You're on mute. Okay, I think.
Hi everyone. Good morning to all. I just want to thank you all for joining us on this call. And on behalf of Supervisor Hilda Solis, we're very happy to be here. There's various efforts that are underway and have been implemented at the County of Los Angeles. And what I'm going to do is just touch upon a few highlights of some of the efforts that are focused on the green infrastructure gentrification aspect. And but first, I also wanted to acknowledge all the partners that today are here and that put this together. This is very important. I know for the county, the issues of equity and displacement are very paramount in all of our communities, and so this is a very important matter. And it's it's not one tool fixes everything. I mean, it takes various tools and strategies to really try to address this very impacting situation with displacement in our communities. And in regards to gentrification and displacement, we know that it's a very real situation, and especially in communities of color and low-income communities. And so gentrification has far-reaching impacts, social, cultural, economic, and public health impacts. And so with that, I want to share that I'm going to be highlighting 5 main efforts, which are Measure A, WHAM, the LA River Master Plan Update, the Lower LA River Toolkit, and prioritizing affordable housing in at risk of displacement areas. And so with that, I wanted to start off with Measure A. Measure A is, I don't know, for many of you, you may know, but it's the Safe, Clean Neighborhood Parks and Open Space measure that basically funds, it was put on the ballot and it was passed in 2016, and it created a funding opportunity for new parks. And at the crux of it was, Supervisor Solis was very key in moving that to a ballot by her efforts. And in particular, there was a county-wide parks and recreation needs assessment. And from that, it lifted many communities that were park poor and again, low income, and again, didn't have adequate access. There's inequities in access to open space. And as we've, from our speakers prior, having access to open space provides, many health benefits to communities. And so at the crux of this measure was to focus these, funding opportunities, in particular to the areas that were high risk and again, they're park poor communities. And so something that was very unique with this measure was that it had embedded in its goals and actions various anti-displacement strategies, and that's something that you don't see in many measures. And so this was something very particular, and we were happy that this was embedded in the measure, because it was really to target and help the communities most at need. Related to this, we have WHAM. WHAM, it's an acronym that stands for the 4 measures that the County of Los Angeles has had. WHAM, W stands for Measure W, which funds stormwater infrastructure projects. H stands for, the measure that funds homeless housing and services. A, as we talked about a few minutes ago, funds parks and park improvements and river and beaches and many other open space opportunities. And M funds transportation infrastructure projects. And so there's a motion by Supervisor Kuhl and Hilda Solis to create a task force. And the task was really to, have coordination amongst these very key measures, funding measures that, again, and so that they were not just working in silos, and that we basically prioritize multi-benefit projects. And especially, one of the outcomes was, one of the key objectives is actually to have a coordination of various metrics and also strategies, anti-displacement strategies that were kind of similar from the Measure A, and extending them to the other measures. And so that is another effort that's underway, and we're very excited because this coordination will really help, again, result in multi-benefit community serving projects, and also leveraging the resources, and again, include anti-displacement, goals and efforts. And so with that, I also wanted to share in regards to the LA River Master Plan. This is a 51-mile river corridor in the County of Los Angeles. It touches many jurisdictions, and it went through a 2-year, very robust, community engagement process. And out of that process, very key that was raised by many stakeholders was the concerns with, displacement and gentrification, given the 54 major projects that are planned along the corridor, and 22 proposed project sites as well. So there was a high concern in regards to that, and given the outcry, what it resulted is that in order to address green gentrification there, there's been a goal, goal 6, that has been included in the draft master plan, that is actually getting, finalized, and it's being getting ready to be put out, for public release, and with the hopes of adopting it at the end of the year. But this document actually is very key because it talks about various revitalization efforts for the river along the whole corridor, but paramount was to include, policies, goals, and actions, including an implementation matrix to ensure that there were clear steps to carry out these goals. And some of the goals, for instance, are, to, identify funding for land banking along the river to produce affordable housing, and also to fund projects that are along, in proximity of the river. Those are some of the items that are included in the goal 6. So this is a very key effort for the county. Related to the river, we have the Lower LA River, which is a segment to the south on the southerly part of the river. And it has a state revitalization plan for the Lower LA River. And part of the revitalization plan was it included a community stabilization toolkit. And this was very key because, again, in that stretch as well, there was an outcry, concerns with, gentrification that would come from the various projects that were envisioned for that segment of the river. And so, as part of the toolkit, there was, community benefit agreements, inclusionary housing. Inclusionary housing is, whenever you have by right, market rate housing, there's a certain percentage set aside for affordable housing. And so that was one of the tools that was, brought up or included in the toolkit for jurisdictions. The other was rent stabilization ordinances. Again, Faizah brought it up in regards to, that's a tenant protection ordinance that puts a cap on rent increases amongst many things. And so the county, by the way, does have rent stabilization ordinances for properties that are 1995 and older. And we also do have inclusionary housing ordinance as well. And so those were some of the tools that were, again, lifted up for jurisdictions. So that really helped to address or start addressing the issue of gentrification. Lastly, but not the least, is there's an effort to prioritize affordable housing in areas of displacement risk. And this was prompted by a motion by Supervisor Hilda Solis in January. And what that created was basically a mapping effort of the various major infrastructure, public and private projects. And so in particular, that also included the Alley River, corridor projects, as well as the many major park projects. And so part of that effort was, to identify recommendations on how to address or curtail displacement tied to major infrastructure. And so an outcome immediately that emerged was that as part of our affordable housing funding resources, we have funding for building new and preserving affordable housing and for acquisition. So a priority was created for that to fund projects that were located in areas that were identified at risk for displacement, given the mapping effort. And so we're very happy that that started out in a very good way to start, addressing, displacement through major infrastructure projects and green infrastructure in particular. And so with that, these were some of the highlights of the many efforts, as I said, that are underway in the county. And in closing, I just want to emphasize that what we've learned that has been very key in order to create a systems change is that it starts out, many times by, putting in place policies and actions in major, like in measures and in grants administration documents and master plans that can serve as a first step many times, leading to other opportunities and other strategies. And also it's very key that when we have redevelopment projects that these projects, have the community very much in mind. In order to move efforts such as these, anti-displacement strategies, what also has been very key is that there needs to be partnerships and alliances between advocates from, climate change, affordable housing, open space, green infrastructure, and public health. There's definitely a lot of, the gentrification affects many sectors. And so having alliances is really very key to be able to start moving these strategies forward. And with that, I just want to thank you again for having us, and we'll be here if you have any questions. We'll be more than happy to answer them.
Thank you, Guadalupe Duran-Medina with Supervisor Solis' office, Planning Deputy. So now we'll move on to questions that we have received throughout the chat. So I invite all of the panelists to self-select yourselves to answer some of these. One of the first questions is, what are some examples of getting green investment right beyond Los Angeles? If anyone would like to take that. And obviously that's, according to you and this guide. If there are any good examples of green infrastructure, green investment projects.
So I can answer that. There's a lot of projects all over the country, and so the guide actually includes some case studies of good projects. So I think we talk about Unity Park in South Carolina, the 11th Street Bridge project in DC, and then for LA, like honestly, there's not, I don't want to talk about like this is the perfect project, but really to get people to understand that this is a process that requires engagement, and it's constantly shifting depending on what is happening, what kind of partnerships exist, what kind of resources. So for a long time, the LA River restoration was something that we were like debating within our organization. Do we fight it? You know, and now it's being held as like this model. And that was because it took many years of collaboration, advocacy, trust building between SECA and public counsel, and then like the river advocates and the river agencies, right? To get them to understand that housing justice could be part of a restoration plan, and developing strategies that they felt made sense for them to implement, right? Like I said before, we don't want people to engage in mission drift. Department of Public Works and Audubon aren't going to be building housing all of a sudden, but how do we get them to become speaker boxes for the need for a comprehensive housing justice policy as part of green infrastructure development? And so I think the WHAM motion is really a fundamental like outgrowth of all of that, right? The desire for these different departments to address this huge issue, and is, it's still in progress, and I'm really excited for the work ahead, but it is still in progress. So yeah, I would say WHAM motion, LA River Master Plan.
Thank you, Sissy. Would anyone else like to add anything, or we can move on to another question? Okay, great. How did you all go about building this diverse group of partners, and what was the partnership process like?
I guess I could speak a little to that. Like Sissy was saying earlier, it started off with with a cup of coffee and talking about the community, and us both have worked in the community for a long time. And then I feel once we started to see a project and work on it, it was really understanding who needs to be or the voices that need to be a part of the process, and really looking at our networks. And I think for us, I think this team was a natural fit. I really enjoyed working with everyone, and I feel that we were able to assemble a group of folks that were able to bring expertise into the project in a way that was very inclusive, because that's how we think. Those are we didn't really have to convince each other, you know, that we need to look at this through a lens of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and it was more working with each other to understand things that we just didn't know or were not aware of. So I would pass it along to anyone if they wanted to add to that.
Thank you, Marcos. So moving on to the topic of housing specifically, we have a couple of questions related that I'm going to consolidate. And it seems like green infrastructure is inevitably tied to development, right? And making areas more attractive and alluring to other folks that may not have been from the community. So with that said, I think Faizah and Guadalupe can help with these next questions. And they consist of what is considered affordable housing in LA, and Someone from the chat says they've been trying to wrap their head around the dichotomy between wanting to bring in community of amenities versus creating desirable areas for development, resulting in gentrification, as we just mentioned. So the inextricable nexus between green development and housing, and what specific tools do organizations have to keep luxury market rate developers from taking advantage? So, triple prong question.
Well, do you want to start, Faizah, or I could start some of that?
You can go if you're ready.
So in regards to, you know, the issue of what are we doing, you know, in regards to, I think right now there's a big interest to put in place to target areas that are high, you know, high in regards to risk for displacement. And in terms of, you know, funding resources, those are trying to be, you know, they're trying to be targeted to those areas most at risk. But in regards to, you know, we have, you know, again, many developments sometimes coming into the county, and there is market rate. And so through tools such as inclusionary zoning, that helps curtail, you know, again, you know, so that there is inclusion, 20%, you know, set aside, for instance. The county is divided in like 5 submarkets. And so there's a requirement of a certain percentage being set aside for affordable housing. That's an example of a tool, like when there's market rate entities, that tool was specifically meant to address that type of development to ensure that the market rate development included some affordable. And so in regards to affordability, affordable is really set up by the state, right? There's a range, you know, from, you know, 0 to, you know, 80% AMI. That's the low income, very low income, extremely low income. That's the range in between, right? For above 80% AMI, and it's considered moderate, and up to 120% AMI, and workforce is, you know, another range, which is, you know, up to 150% AMI, between 120 and 150% AMI. So there's ranges of affordability that, depending on the funding sources, when a project is built, depending on the funding sources, you know, the target many times is, you know, especially the very low income, which is, you know, 30% AMI and below. And that is especially for folks that are coming from being homeless, if you will. And so, but the range is, you know, from 0 to 80% AMI, if you will, in terms of low income. And I don't know if you want to add anything, Faizah, but, you know, those are typically set by the state. And we know that there's been a big push from community as well to try to have even more affordability, you know, built into those ranges. But, you know, again, they are set by the state. And if changes are needed, I think we would need to do something at the state level, correct? In order to affect those ranges.
Yeah, so I'll just add to what Guadalupe said. There's a range of what's considered affordable, and, you know, the question is always, when a project comes in, it's affordable to whom? And I think affordability is usually defined as 30% of a person's income, but when you're talking about a project coming in, it's like, what's, you know, there's the range of low income, very low income, extremely low, and then deeply. And so I think it's important, the strategies that are in the guide are really, a lot of them are strategies that need to be put in place before developments happen. And then there are some strategies that should be accompanying a development. But, you know, targeting and working with the community, understanding the community that a project is going to go into and what those communities' needs are. And so when it comes to housing, it's understanding what's the level of affordability that's needed in that community in order for that community to remain. And so I think it's different. And then I think in terms of, I'm trying to understand, there's a lot of questions, so I want to make sure I'm answering. But I think, you know, the key is targeting affordability to the needs of that particular community. And that's where it's important to engage with community partners like to understand.
And I think I just want to add that I think with any development, community engagement is paramount, because that's, and understanding, you know, again, the area where the project is proposed. And many times in regards to, you know, just the question, because even when housing, for instance, is built, a lot of times people are saying, well, this is not meant for us. How are we going to get into the units? There is a fair housing law that basically says we can't, you know, specifically say that certain people can only apply to a given project. That is a law. But one of the ways that we've been working to address that concern of access to the local community is by really engaging, you know, each developer and saying that if you're going to come in, this is very important that you do an early notification and a very targeted local outreach in regards to the upcoming housing opportunities, because they do need to advertise to the whole, you know, universe, if you will, as part of the fair housing law. But there's ways to target the outreach and ahead of, you know, the regular outreach to the local community, and having workshops to let people know, for instance, you know, just what are the requirements for affordability, you know, in regards to the income qualifications of a person, what documents you need to apply, having technical assistance ahead, again, available to the local community, so that we have the most opportunity given to the local community to apply and get into those units. So that's one of the ways that we've been able to help with that concern. And obviously, we would love to work with people to try to change the law at the state to allow for a local preference. You know, that's out there as an interest, but absent of that, that's how we've been able to ensure the local folks have, you know, more of an opportunity to have access.
Thank you both. We have another question, which is, are creating and subsidizing public land trust being considered? And can you expand on this if this is in the guide or relative to the LA River Master Plan? Public land trust.
I could speak in regards to you know, the county. We are definitely looking at also the opportunity of community land trusts, given the, you know, the wealth, you know, that equity and building wealth opportunities for community stakeholders and tenants, ownership opportunities. And so we are exploring that, and that is something very of high interest as well for Supervisor Solis and the county. And in the guide, I think Faizah, you do mention it as part of the guide as one of the tools, right?
Also, just FYI, the LA River Master Plan actually calls for the development of an affordable housing land bank as part of that investment. And for those that don't know the difference, a land bank is a tool that could be either a nonprofit or a government agency that establishes a system for acquiring land quickly. And then what they end up doing is handing over the land. It could be to another government agency or to another nonprofit for different uses. So for example, MRCA, Mountains Recreation Conservation Authority, could be the entity that takes the land and then holds onto it until we have an affordable housing developer or a park developer that's ready to do development, or we put it into a land trust. So the trust is responsible for the long-term development and manage you know, operations and management of a particular parcel, whether it's a park or an affordable housing complex. But we also, you know, we need entities that can quickly acquire land and then hold on to it while the park and housing developers are getting their financing together. Because sometimes it can take like 2 to 3 years to pull together the financing for a deal. And by that point, like, you know, the property owner might be like, I don't want to wait 2 or 3 years to get paid to sell this land. So we need both tools. And so that's what we've been working on, is the establishment of the land bank. And then that gives us a little bit of breathing room to do the land trust.
Thank you. Is there anything specifically targeting homelessness in the guide?
So yes, I was waiting for Faizah to answer because she knows more about this stuff than I do. I think part of it is with the homelessness, you know, we talk a lot, homeless get policed in parks heavily. And so a lot of the strategies we talk about are partnerships that connect homeless, you know, park agencies with homeless service providers and social service providers, so that they don't get policed, that they get the services they need, right? Doing design and to discourage hostile architecture. A lot of hostile architecture also targets homeless folks, and making sure that we don't encourage that. And then, you know, some of the strategies around housing, it's a little technical, but like, for example, the land bank could be, instead of a community land trust for affordable housing, could be used as an acquisition strategy for homeless supportive housing as well. So those are not mutually exclusive.
Faizah, would you like to add anything?
No, I thought that was a good summary. Thanks, Sissy.
Great. Back to WHAM, which seems to be a really great collaborative motion that looks at all of the issues collaboratively and not in silos. Was WHAM motivated by this collaboration of community organizations, or was it something that unfolded parallel to it? One of our participants is curious to see how this guide best fits community practices and ultimately interfaces with policymakers.
Well, definitely, WHAM was brought upon because of the coalition of many advocates that was brought up to the board. And so there was a need for coordination and alignment. And so, yes, definitely the community organizations, advocates actually were the impetus, you know, to bring upon this motion that led to the WHAM.
Great, thank you. Let's see. We have another comment and question, which is, I appreciate that LA County sees the importance of inclusionary housing policies around the LA River, but have there been efforts to get other river cities, including the city of LA, on board with adopting and implementing these same approaches?
Well, as part of the LA River Master Plan effort, there was, you know, a lot of coordination with, you know, with the city of LA and many jurisdictions along the corridor. And so this master plan actually has, you know, again, included various goals and implementation actions and to address displacement. And, but in terms of an inclusionary ordinance, I think that's what you're referring to, correct? That's what you're saying. You know, that I know that they've developed a transit orient. It's similar, but it's called transit oriented communities plan that basically, especially along major transportation corridors, they have developed. I'm not representing the city of LA here, but generally, I understand that there is a transit-oriented communities plan, that initiative that actually gives, you know, incentives, land use incentives in exchange for density and set-asides for affordable units. And so that is what they have for sure in place. In terms of more details, we could provide a link in regards to that program.
Thank you. We have a few more questions before we have closing remarks. And the next question is, curious how the tenant protections mentioned bring development stakeholders into the conversation. These are groups that stand to profit the most from changes in land value due to greening. How can they be held accountable or kept in check according to your recommendations in the guide?
Well, I guess I'll let Sissy take the last question, so I'll take this one. I think, you know, I think organizing is really important. I think getting communities engaged to put pressure on elected officials and on developers to provide the affordable housing and ensure put the policies in place that are going to keep tenants in their homes is the key. And then, you know, advocacy campaigns to ensure more planning ahead that doesn't displace tenants. And so another campaign Sissy and I are working on together has to do with the Downtown LA Community Plan. And that is a plan that the City of LA is putting together that's going to serve as the plan for downtown for the next 20 years. And in that plan, they include a bunch of policies and zoning and priorities for the downtown area in which Chinatown is located, where Sissy works. And I think we're advocating for stronger anti-displacement policies, stronger tenant protections, more open space, all the things we talk about in our guide in that plan in the and that's going to serve as a long-term plan for the city for downtown. So I think it's about organizing, it's about planning, it's about communities getting together to demand more equitable plans. I don't know, Sissy, if you want to add anything.
No.
Sticking on the subject of development and housing, in the end, how much affordable and equitable housing actually happens after the developers have their say?
Well, I mean, in terms of developers, I mean, there's nonprofit developers and for-profit developers. And so I know that there's, again, many areas, you know, in the county, there are very different market areas. And, but I think advocacy and the support of the, you know, like those that are in decision-making power, I think, you know, when developers come into an area, it is very important to set the tone that it's important to include, you know, affordable. And in our areas, we're very, you know, grateful that there's various nonprofit housing developers that we've established a lot of, again, a lot of working relationships, and they have, you know, come into especially unincorporated areas of the county, and have developed a lot of, you know, affordable housing, working in tandem with the community and many of the community stakeholder groups and residents. And so, you know, in terms of, you know, market rate developers, when they come in, you know, if they are going to need, for instance, a zone change or they need something from the county, a land use, it's important to use that as a negotiating tool to, you know, ensure affordability. You know, again, especially if they're having to go through public hearing procedures, it is important to ensure that the developer presents to the community, makes them aware what the proposal is, and try to negotiate to basically include affordable housing. And so we've been able to address that through that, you know, through those mechanisms. And now, given that in the unincorporated area, we do have an inclusionary zoning ordinance, that will help a great deal. There's also other land use ordinances that have been put in place, you know, and are coming down the line, you know, being adopted soon to, you know, preserve affordable housing, you know, to encourage and facilitate multi-family affordable housing. And there's various ordinances that are underway to try to facilitate and encourage you know, the development of affordable housing. We also have some state laws, right, that are also providing some incentives in exchange for affordable housing and set-asides and densities. So it's always, you know, a good pitch to make, you know, if you want relief from this or that, you know, there's this tool or this law that's available that allows for affordable housing, but you get relief in regards to some of the land use requirements. And so, you know, the transit-oriented district projects as well, that facilitates housing, affordable housing, as well as, and it reduces parking requirements. Those are some of the ordinances, some of the tools that are out there that if there's market rate developers, we make them aware of those laws, and we work with them. But you know, it is a case by case, you know, issue because you know, some developers, if they don't need anything from the county, you know, they will just, you know, build it and you won't know about it, right? That's the tension there. They could get permits over the counter, right, if you will. And so if they build within the zone. So, but again, it's a case by case matter, and that's how we've been able to address affordability.
We haven't heard from Marcos in a while, and we have a specific question. Now that Audubon has been able to offer its perspective and input into the guide, how will you continue to be involved?
Thank you for the question. I feel when we look at, or as we talk about a lot of these issues and how it relates to conservation, we have to understand that the way it connects is really influencing how we look at urban conservation and conservation that is done within a community. When we look at homelessness and affordable housing and mental health and substance abuse, all these issues that normally a conservation organization would do this, cover their ears and cover their eyes and not want to deal with, let the social workers work with that. We are now seeing how that affects conservation in an urban area, like we were talking about, parks being policed. And when you have people that can no longer afford to live in their communities or in a home or in a physical structure, they're moving into parks such as Debs Park. And for us, we don't look at the people as the threat. We look at homelessness as a threat. We look at the lack of affordable housing as a threat. And it being a threat, we look at it through the lens of how is this going to impact wildlife? How is it going to impact the work that we're doing if we're spending a lot of resources on producing habitat for wildlife and leading tours out and connecting people with the environment, and someone accidentally sets fire to our location because they're trying to stay warm or they're trying to cook food, that then becomes the threat. So for us to actively look at how we take a holistic approach to addressing these issues means that we need to continue to partner with organizations like SECA and Public Counsel, and we need to continue to be on the coalitions that have influenced the county to adopt these measures in a way, or champion these measures in a way as Supervisor Solis has done. So as we look at this and our involvement to move forward, we're looking at all the other areas in our Audubon network that work along rivers, that have nature centers along rivers. We're looking at what can be adopted or applied in a number of different areas. As we had written this guide, it's specifically for Los Angeles River, but we included a lot of different case studies from around the country, so these things can be applied throughout the space. So now that we look at the project and where it goes from now, it is really shifting how we view work in an urban area. And we're hoping to continue partnerships like this and encourage people to look for these, what is considered in the conservation field, non-traditional partnerships. This is for Audubon in California is now considered a very traditional partnership, where we need to be working with community organizations so they can do what they're great at.
Thank you. And as a parks organization, we couldn't agree more. We have a few more questions and then we will come to a close. I don't know if anyone on the panel can answer this, but it seems like we have someone joining us from San Diego. The question is, thank you for the information on the LA River Master Plan. It sounds like a big step in the right direction. Is there a similar plan for the San Diego River? Not sure if anyone on the panel knows. No. Unfortunately, no, but I will tell you there is a San Diego Conservancy and they're a state agency, and we'd be happy to connect you with them, or you can reach out to them as well directly. And that's the San Diego Conservancy. Okay, moving on. I'm not sure what the acronym for this question is, but can MJ cash that are in bonded warehouses that cannot go into the Fed bank system be put into a land bank? Oh, marijuana. Can marijuana cash that's bonded in warehouses that cannot go into the Fed bank system be put into a land bank?
I have no idea. I will be honest. I think we're looking for different and creative tools to help finance and seed the land bank. So, you know, I think Guadalupe talked about the $41 million coming from the state last year, but I don't know about marijuana specifically.
Okay. Do you know about any examples of unincorporated communities who do not get equitable resources from city government, and how is that addressed?
Again, there's many underserved areas, such as East LA or Southeast LA. I'm talking about, you know, the areas that we know in our district that historically for many years there's been underinvestment, and there's a lot of need. And again, we're working with many advocates and stakeholders, you know, to bring in different tools and different services, increasing park space, you know, encouraging as much as possible multi-benefit projects. We have our county, you know, for instance, county assets, which I haven't spoken about, but these are opportunities for multi-benefit projects. And so we, as much as possible, try to bring in resources and services through community outreach, being a very key process for you know, services. It's very general, but I mean, every area there's, you know, we have a focus on businesses, programs that target and, you know, encouraging affordable housing, you know, and many other services, public infrastructure, you know, projects, pedestrian safety. You know, there's so many resources that are at the county that, you know, we're trying to focus in on in these areas that, again, are of high need.
I know I want to share that especially working with CBOs has been very instrumental, because in some of those areas, even though there is a high need, there's always a myth about, misconceptions about homeless individuals and low-income housing units. And that itself is an issue that is very paramount in communities where, even though there's a need, there's at the same time a lack of understanding of the need in many communities. And a lot of times there's pushback, right? And like you may have pushback as well for open space because of the concern of gentrification, right? But there's also pushback because a lot of folks have misconceptions of affordable housing at the same time, and they don't want to allow it. And so there's a lot of work to be done. And so working with our CBOs has really helped to move along, bringing in, projects that, have affordable housing and projects that have, open space or other amenities that are needed. For instance, we have a project in the East LA that on a public county land, and the community supported a pocket park along with housing, and again, all affordable, and local hiring as part of the project, art. So there's many aspects that are being fulfilled there. And so encouraging multi-benefit projects has been one of the ways to bring services to unincorporated areas that are much in need.
I would also add too that with Measure A, the park measure, financing measure, part of the expenditure plan requires 30% of the funds to go towards high and very high need areas. So the county in 2016, I believe, did a park needs assessment looking at, where there are areas that are park poor all across the region, and then kind of are looking to strategically deploy resources in areas that have not seen parks in the past. I think, the WHAM measure we've talked a lot about. One of the companion measures that came about, due to Supervisor Solis, Guadalupe's boss, her leadership was to really think about also where there's like risk, right? So we want to build parks in these park poor areas, but we need to be predictive and get ahead of the gentrification and displacement cycle. And so, as part of the due diligence is to look at where the areas where new investment is likely to happen and is likely to have a destabilizing impact, and then to strategically deploy stabilization resources there. So it may not be equal in the sense of like every neighborhood gets, affordable housing, but I think it's about strategically deploying the areas that are at highest need and at highest risk.
Thank you. Okay, before we close, this is a really great question because we as a parks agency, constantly face this issue, and I'm sure, somewhere like Audubon Center at Debs, the maintenance cost of keeping up a facility or an open space quickly outstrips the construction cost, which is 110% true. Do you all have any ideas about how to maintain these open spaces that would serve equity goals?
Yeah, I can jump in there. I know one method that we have, and it cannot be only this approach. It needs to be a number of things. But one thing that we're doing, and what a lot of our work is about, is engaging community and connecting them with the spaces that we're looking at. So a lot of that means bringing in programming that will help deter activity that leads to an increase in maintenance. Also bringing community members, school groups out as part of a volunteer process, and a lot of this is to not just to bring in free labor, but really make a connection with the community and their area, so we can also advocate to have funding available or push against any measures or bills that are going to limit funding to parks. And I know for us it's really hard. You can't get bond money for ongoing maintenance. But these measures just really looking at what is the percentage of funds available to bring in funding. And then it's really partnerships, is getting partnerships. Everyone has a stake in this. And for us, it's really trying to get as many folks to the table as we can to help bring resources in there, because ultimately it's gonna be on us to make sure that we're putting pressure on the systems that would allow funding for projects
And Sarah, you know too, like the model that we've been exploring together as part of the La Rosa, which is the LA Regional Open Space and Affordable Housing Collaborative, is joint development, right? Mm-hmm. So building housing and parks together. And so the idea is, and what we learned in our partnership, you know, as part of the La Rosa Collaborative, was that park agencies have money for capital acquisition, but almost no money for operations and maintenance. With housing agencies and organizations, it's the reverse. They don't have money for acquisition, but they have money for operations and maintenance through the rents they charge their tenants. And so one thing that we're researching and trying to figure out, and is super complicated, is the idea that like the park agency would acquire the land, subdivide a portion of it, not all of it, a portion of it, and then rent it to the housing developer, right? And then charge the developer like annual rents that might be below market rate. And that the revenue from the rent of the affordable housing building, which is being managed by the affordable housing developer, not the park agency, would then go towards operations and maintenance by the park agency itself.
We look forward to that guide too, Sissy. On that note, does the panel have any last thoughts? What are some of your hopes for the guide and or next steps for this group? You all as the panel and the authors of the Greening in Place guide.
Apparently you guys are going to fund us to do another guide on financing of joint development.
I'm bored.
I think I'd just like to throw out there, especially to a lot of the big conservation organizations, and just really encourage our partners to look at projects a bit more holistically, and not just work in urban areas with the same mindset of how we would do conservation work in large open space where there's thousands of acres or hundreds of thousands of acres, but really look at the human element, the people part of the work that we do, and go out there and be in the community and really invest in the community in many different ways, because amazing partnerships like this happen when the work is done with intention and when it's done genuinely.
And I'll just add really quickly, I think, yeah, I think having intentional partnerships, and it's just been a great process to work with our background is in housing and land use. And so just understanding the conservation side has been really important in understanding where Audubon sees itself in this work, has been great. And I think just to return to the guide itself, I just emphasizing there's so many tools, and with each project, you have to think about like what are the needs of this community and how can they be achieved, and what are the tools that we can deploy. And some of those tools, I mean, we should be advocating citywide and advocating right now. They should be part of long-term planning, like in the downtown community plan. And then also there are tools that will come up with specific projects and you see that this is a need that needs to be met. And so how do you get there? And how do you form the community partnerships to get there and achieve the results that we want? And Public Counsel is just happy to support this work.
On behalf of Supervisor Solis, I just want to thank everyone. This has been very great conversation. I think to have these more often, I think we would learn a lot more, and I think be able to establish more, more tools that can better protect our neighborhoods. And I know that a lot of the tools that are in place or will come in place, they may not be perfect, but I think what's important is to have that, alliance and partnerships across many sectors in order to improve upon them and to make them more and more, appropriate and serving, the community. But I think we need to start somewhere, and I think it's important to take, like Sissy was talking earlier. We may have to take baby steps, but start somewhere and not get discouraged and keep on and have those intentional partnerships, as Faizah was saying.
Thank you, Guadalupe. I'll wrap us up super quickly here, as I know we're at the end of our time, but I do just really want to extend a thank you to everyone who attended today for joining this conversation and for being a part of it. There was a lot of information shared today, so we really hope that this will just kind of be a starting point for further conversation and engagement. You can contact us at debspark@audubon.org. That contact is on the Greening in Place website. I want to thank Sarah and Guadalupe so much for joining us today as well. We really appreciate your valuable insight and hope to continue these conversations with you both also. And like I mentioned, I'll be sending out the follow-up email, which will have the recording of this. So please share that within your networks. Even if you're not directly connected with a park agency or park developer, it's a really awesome resource to just advocate for more equitable green development in your own communities. So please, yes, continue to use this as a tool and continue to use this group of partners as a resource as well. With that, I think we'll wrap up today. I hope everyone has a great rest of their days. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.